Today's talk is the Armenian Genocide Memorial Lecture. And the fund that underwrites the lecture was established in 2005 by Christine Dzovinar. Here, Christine, can you raise your hand? Christine is currently the co-president of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide. Besides being very generous to the university in her philanthropy, she does a lot of the heavy lifting behind the scenes that often goes unnoticed because our lecture series runs so smoothly. And one of the reasons it runs smoothly is because of Christine. In 2005, Christine wanted to ensure that a lecture on the Armenian Genocide was included each year in our programming. He solicited donations from Armenians of North Bay, a local heritage foundation. And the first significant funds came from the Thomas Family Foundation, which is a longtime Armenian-American family here in Sonoma County. Significant donations also came from the sale of bricks commemorating the Armenian Genocide in Sonoma State's Holocaust and Genocide Memorial Grove, which you can see on the backside of campus. Over the years, more than 20 lectures on the Armenian Genocide have been part of our lecture series. Speakers have included Richard Havanesian, Stephen Asturian, Robert Krikorian, Sergio Laporta, and last year, Ronald Suni. Several Armenian filmmakers have presented here documentaries about the genocide, including Orphans of the Genocide, which was made on the occasion of the 100th anniversary. We also hosted the Bay Area premiere of Women of 1915, as well as a screening of Prose of the Desert and The Stateless Diplomat, Diana Apakar's heroic life. The Armenian scholar Hasmik Havlidinian presented her work here on recovering lost Armenian lullabies and performed here with the Kitka Women's Vocal Ensemble. Christine has recently reconfigured her philanthropy by creating the Mary Dalbashi and Davidian Armenian Genocide Education Endowment, which will guarantee a steady stream of funds to Armenian programming in future years. Thank you, Christine. Our speaker today is my friend, Dzovinar Derderian. I first met Dzovinar 2 or 3 years ago at our monthly Russian history Kruzhok workshop in Berkeley. Dzovinar is an assistant adjunct professor at Berkeley and executive director of the Armenian Studies program at Berkeley. She holds a PhD from my undergraduate alma mater, the University of Michigan. This means she is a person of great taste and refinement. And she studied at Michigan with Ron Suni, who was my undergraduate advisor and a speaker in our lecture series. We sometimes say that historians of Armenia, like the history of the Armenian people, tilt in one of 3 directions: toward Russia and the Soviet Union, toward Persia and Iran, or toward the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish Republic. Dzovinar falls into the latter camp. Her work investigates the ways that provincial Armenians navigated the multi-ethnic and multi-confessional milieus in which they lived. She is the co-editor of the book, The Ottoman East in the 19th Century, Societies, Identities, and Politics. I'm very pleased to turn the podium over to Dzovinar. Please bear with me now while I get our screen up and running. Why is that not showing? It's not up there is a little worrying. There we go. And now let me share our screen. Right, didn't mean to do that. Okay. So I think you're ready. Nathan, can you confirm that the slides advance once we begin?
I don't see the slides. I just see Looking down.
Yikes. Okay, bear with me. Now you got it. Some in our slides do not want to advance on this screen, but let me. It's much smoother than this. Okay, there we go. We have it now. There we go.
No.
It's not working?
Oh, no, it just took a second. It's gone. It went out.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Steve Davitian, for making this series possible. And thank you, everybody, for being here. And also thank you to Charlene for making my trip to cinema very easy. What I want to do today is focus on the afterlife of the Armenian Genocide through my experience of researching the history of the 19th century Armenians of the Ottoman Empire. As Professor Bittner mentioned, I am specialized in the history of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. And through that also, I want to discuss the denial of the Armenian Genocide in Turkey, as well as to a certain extent in the American Academy, as I think it is very important to reflect on repression of speech in this current moment when higher education is facing increasing restrictions. But before I get there, I thought it would be better to give an overview of the Armenian Genocide for those who have little familiarity with it. So the Armenian Genocide occurred during the rule of the Young Turks, who came to power through the 1908 Constitutional Revolution and existed under the umbrella of the Committee of Union and Progress that included different parties. The Young Turks consisted of a group of intellectuals of the late 1880s that aimed to overthrow the Sultan Abdul Hamid II that was ruling the Ottoman Empire in the last quarter of the 19th century. And the Young Turks wanted to bring an end to his absolutist rule in the Ottoman Empire. Many of the Young Turk intellectuals were in exile in Europe prior to the revolution. They were educated in European schools, had adopted secular positions, heavily relied on scientific approaches like sociology and Darwinism in their understanding of the social organization and progress of humanity. Their aim was to bring back the constitution and the parliament that Abdul Hamid II had suspended in 1878. And they collaborated with non-Turkish and non-Muslim actors of the Ottoman Empire in the beginning, including with Armenians. In particular, they partnered with the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, a party known as Dashnak in Armenian, that was included in the CUP parliament between 1908 and 1920. The 1908 revolution had actually brought much hope among Armenian circles in the Ottoman Empire, and many Armenians had migrated to the United States before the revolution, migrated back to the Ottoman Empire after the revolution. Armenians who had been exiled to Europe from the empire for their resistance against the Hamidian regime also returned back. And some of them, like Fikor Zohrab on the right and Armen Garo on the left, became members of the Ottoman parliament. Yet in 1915, Grigor Zohrab was killed as one of the first victims of the Armenian Genocide, while Armen Garo escaped to the Russian Empire before the genocide began. From the beginning, there were many challenges that the CUP faced. The new regime faced opposition from the empire, from within the empire, and from foreign powers, as it engaged in wars in Tripoli and the Balkans. In an attempt to strengthen its rule while losing territory, the CUP became increasingly authoritarian. When World War I began in 1914, Armenians were still represented in the Ottoman parliament, and still in collaboration with the CUP government. However, their relationship had soured because of a massacre of Armenians that occurred in 1909 in Adana, which is off the coast of the Eastern Mediterranean. 20 to 30,000 Armenians were killed in this massacre, but it did not become clear as to what extent the central state in Istanbul was actually involved in allowing these massacres to happen, whether the massacres were a local event. Additionally, the condition of Armenians in the eastern region of the Ottoman Empire, as you see in the circle, were facing a lot of problems with the security of private property and life. And the Armenians, especially since the 1870s, had been asking for the improvement of conditions, of particularly the provincial, in the provinces, where security of life and property was threatened significantly for Armenians. And this is also where the majority of Armenians of the Ottoman Empire lived prior to the Armenian Genocide. So Armenians had complaints about unjust taxation, unjust land confiscation, and these issues were not being dealt with by the new regime of the Young Turks. As I will explain in a bit, reforms in the eastern provinces had been the main concern of the Armenian revolutionary parties and the Constantinople Armenian Patriarchate that was based in Istanbul, which had acted as representative of the Armenian Ottoman community, as well as the great powers who were pressure on the Ottoman state to implement reforms towards the Armenians. They each had different understandings of how reform was to happen, but they all agreed that reform had to happen for the embetterment of the lives of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. When World War I began, the power of the CUP was tested one more time, particularly through new wars that began in the Ottoman Empire's eastern borderlands. At the end of 1914, Ottoman forces led by Enver Pasha, who was the Ottoman Minister of War and would become one of the masterminds of the Armenian Genocide, faced a terrible defeat against Russian forces at what is now known as the Battle of Sarıkamış, right at the Russo-Ottoman borderland, as you see on this map. Under Enver's command in the Sarıkamış battle, 45,000 men were killed from the Ottoman side, as opposed to 28,000 from the Russian side. In these circumstances, Enver had to take action to reestablish his reputation and power. Armenians, who had a significant presence in the Russian Empire as well, provided some voluntary units aiding the Russian side, which provided just one other reason for the CUP leaders to turn against Armenians of the Ottoman Empire. While the CUP faced serious defeats in the east of the empire, in the west of the empire, they were also fearing the loss of the Ottoman capital, Istanbul, to the Allied powers. Seemingly defenseless against the great powers, the CUP, with the leadership of Talat, Enver, and Cemal Pashas, turned against what they dubbed as the internal enemy, the Armenians. Increasingly, they deemed the Armenians as a security threat, as an obstacle to the survival of their states, which I should emphasize seems to be the excuse that most genocide organizers give as justification for annihilation of their target population, as you may have observed in your various events of genocides. The genocidal act against Armenians began with the rounding up of Armenian intellectuals in Istanbul on April 24th. The imprisonment and their imprisonment and eventual murder. This is why decades later, April 24th would become the day when the Armenian genocide is commemorated in Armenia and Armenian communities throughout the world on this date. After the deportation and massacres began, from one province to another province, from one town to another village, Armenians were forced out of their homes, and women and children were often separated from the men. Some were executed on the spot, others died of thirst, hunger, disease, or exhaustion on their long deportation route. Generally, the deportations went to the Derzor desert. And this is the desert that Talat Pasha had in mind when he said they, meaning the Armenians, can live in the desert but nowhere else, knowing full well the desert was not habitable. On this map, you see the different deportation routes. The circles indicate the sizes of massacres in different parts of the Ottoman Empire. And these yellow stars sort of are acts of resistance by Armenians throughout the genocide that occurred. An estimated 1 million Armenians of the 2 million Armenians residing in the Ottoman Empire were killed. Some Armenian women and children were taken into the homes of Muslim families, forced to converse, or at least detach themselves from their Armenian families and communities. Other Armenian children were taken into state orphanages, where they were forced to become Turkified and forget their Armenian identity. If we can't be certain of the number of Armenians who were killed in the genocide, we can be certain that the genocide brought an end to Armenian communal life in a geography where Armenians had lived for millennia and where they had created art, literature, and architecture. Although some trials took place at the end of World War I, the main perpetrators of the genocide largely escaped punishment, and many of them occupied high-ranking positions in the newly formed Turkish government of the Turkish Republic that was formed in 1923. Talat Pasha, as you see here, and Cemal Pasha, who had escaped the Ottoman Empire by 1918, were assassinated in Germany and Tiflis, respectively. They were assassinated by Armenians as part of what is called the Operation Nemesis, a project in which Armenians had taken upon themselves to punish the perpetrators of the genocide. The Operation Nemesis and its aftermath has been eloquently discussed by Eric Bogosian, an actor that you may be familiar with, in his very eloquent book, The Operation Nemesis. Enver Pasha was assassinated in Tajikistan in 1922, although it's not very clear to what extent Armenians were involved in his assassination. After the term genocide was invented by Raphael Lemkin at the end of World War II, and who, by the way, had the Armenian case in mind when inventing the word genocide. Since the 1960s, and particularly 1970s, when Armenians began their demands for genocide recognition, Turkey has not only vehemently denied the Armenian genocide, but has also led campaigns of genocide denial by creating historical narratives that counter claims of the Armenian genocide, and by attacking and intimidating those who publicly speak of the genocide in Turkey and abroad. Denial of the Armenian genocide was not only limited to Turkey, but until well into the 21st century, that is less than 20 years ago, the American Academy, particularly scholars of the Middle East and the Ottoman Empire, either participated in active discourses of genocide denial or simply ignored Armenians as a people that had significant presence in the Ottoman Empire. It is only in the mid-2000s that famous Ottoman historian Donald Quartet condemned himself and other Ottomanists for either being silent about the Armenian genocide or for outright denial of the genocide, both of which he saw as acts of complicity. While this public admission about the genocide denial in the field served as one more impetus for the field to change track, it did not remain unconsequential for Quartet himself, as he had to resign from his position as chairman of the Institute of Turkish Studies, an organization which received funds from the Turkish government, and that in response to Quartet's statements, the Turkish government threatened to cut funding, so he had to resign from his position. There were, of course, also scholars like Richard Hovhannisyan, who has been part of this series, Vahakan Derderian, among others, who fought against denialism in the American Academy throughout the 1980s and 1990s. But it is not until scholars of Turkish descent, most prominently Taner Akçam, Fatma Müdegöçek, among others, as well as non-Armenian authors who began to write about the Armenian genocide, that it became acceptable to talk about the Armenian genocide in the American Academy. I came to recognize this phenomenon recently when a year ago, the famous historian of Palestine, Rashid Khalidi, in a podcast with my colleague Usama Makusi, who will also speak here, mentioned that the Nakba, that is the removal of Palestinians in 1948 from their homeland, was not really recognized and talked about in the American Academy and beyond until Israeli historians began to write and talk about it. Similarly, for decades, even among historians of Armenian descent, Ottoman and German sources were deemed to be more reliable and more objective sources to talk about the Armenian genocide than Armenian sources. So Germany was also an ally of the Ottoman Empire, so had a role in the Armenian genocide as well. Vahakan Derderian, for example, the historian of the Armenian genocide, heavily relied on German and Ottoman sources in his attempt to try to prove the genocide, because he believed the Ottoman and German sources were in some ways more objective than the victims themselves. I think in this moment when there is so much repression to speak about the systemic violence committed against Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, it is important that we take these examples and think about what makes genocide and violence reliable in academic and more popular circles. Why voices belonging to the perpetrator groups, as well as the archival sources belonging to the perpetrator groups, have been considered as more reliable than those of the victims. But in the last 15 to 20 years or so, a little before I started my graduate studies, approaches to archives and what constitutes reliable source started to change the field of Ottoman studies. And particularly to research on Armenians in the Ottoman Empire has changed significantly. If changes regarding the Armenian genocide in the American Academy and to a certain extent in the Turkish Academy had not occurred, I don't think it would have been possible for me and others in my generation to start our graduate studies with a focus on Armenian sources and studying Armenians in the Ottoman Empire before the genocide. So for the next half of my talk, as I narrate you my experience with archives, I will try to also explain why approaches to Armenian sources have changed. I am a historian who has focused on the history of Armenians of the eastern regions of the Ottoman Empire, as I mentioned, that is now referred to as Western Armenia by many Armenians. Armenians, as far as we have any sort of proof, lived in this region, particularly in the region of Fant, which is the center of my research, at least since 500 BCE. Since my research has focused on exploring the dynamic social, political, and economic life that Armenians led in these parts of the Ottoman Empire prior to their complete annihilation, I thought it would be apt to speak to you today about what it means to do research on a people that have been erased from the region under study, what it means to research communities that have completely been uprooted, and also a people and its history that keep being erased from this territory, continue to be seen as an outcast in Turkey. What I want to show is that if physical annihilation of Armenians in this region had been completed, the erasure of their history, the prior existence of Armenians in this region has been a continuous process since the beginning of the formation of the Republic of Turkey. And hopefully this can also get you to think more about the afterlives and long-term effects of genocide, particularly the ones that are not recognized. As a historian of the mid-19th century, to avoid teleological argument, I try to disassociate myself or my work from the genocide. In other words, I try to write about history from the point of view of the given historical moment, rather than from the point of view of the event of genocide that happened decades later. Yet both in the process of conducting research and in the process of writing the history of the 19th century, I saw the impact of the genocide at various turns. And I will explain how and why. Through telling my own narrative, I hope to also answer some questions that baffle some non-Armenians that I have talked with, which is why and how Armenians keep thinking, remembering, and commemorating the Armenian genocide throughout the world. Now, I will turn where the research of most historians begins, that is the archives. More particularly, I want to talk about the Ottoman archives in its traditional and non-traditional definitions. Traditionally, the Ottoman archives is understood as the archival material housed in this building, or rather complex, that essentially represents the archives of the Ottoman state. For decades, much of the history of the Ottoman Empire focused on these archives, and Ottoman history was also largely conceived of as the history of Sunni Muslims and Turkish-speaking Sunni Muslims. In its new location, Kaytane, so this archive moved around 2012. The building of the Ottoman archival complex falls on a route of fast traffic in Istanbul. On the sidewalks, one can spot lone researchers who are walking back and forth from the bus stop to the archive. Uncanny to most neighborhoods of Istanbul, this area lacks any stores, cafes, restaurants, and people. Only some high-rise buildings can be seen in the background, as you see in the picture. Male and female guards stand at the security checkpoint of the archive. Bags have to be checked through a scanner. Individual ID cards with an image of the Turkish flag and the researcher's photograph also have to be hanged around one's neck while present at the archive. After the security check, I go through the yard and enter the main building of the archive. Another guard scans my ID and records my entry in the archive's computer system, upon which I'm provided with a locker key. Most personal items have to be stored away in an archive. The Turkish state certainly makes its presence felt in this institution, and these practices of control that applies to all that enter the archive makes one feel under constant oversight. Upon entry into the building, one immediately appears in a large, empty, and rather dark space. This newly built postmodern edifice with large, empty spaces sets the imperial tone of Turkey's past and echoes the neo-Ottoman project of the current Turkish administration. In the reading room of the Ottoman archives, as you see in this picture, books are not immediately visible and the walls are void of any art. It is a clinical space reminiscent of modern, highly standardized bureaucracies. The room where financial transaction and registration occurs is located on the first floor. It houses a collection of books, mostly in Turkish and some in English. The most visible books, or at least the ones that grasped my attention, pertained to the history of Armenians. While waiting for the transactions to take place, I picked up one of the books and began to read the introduction. It asserted that Armenians in the Ottoman Empire lived happily together and got along with Muslims until the end of the 19th century, when they were manipulated by the Europeans and fell for the incitements of the colonialists, meaning the British, the French, and the Russians. And they, the Armenians, were the traitors. These books included collections of documents meant to demonstrate that Armenians were and are traitors, a representation of Armenians that began to be propagated in the Ottoman Empire, particularly after the Russo-Ottoman War of 1877 and 78, when the Ottomans lost the eastern provinces of Kars and Ardahan to the Russian Empire. Armenians of the Russian Empire had participated in the war from the Russian side, which had precipitated some of these stereotypes on all Armenians. But more importantly, in the Treaty of Berlin that was signed in 1878, the great powers demanded that the Ottoman Empire enact reforms to guarantee the security and well-being of Armenians, particularly in the eastern provinces of the Ottoman Empire, where, as I mentioned before, the majority of Armenians lived. As such, Armenians became a means through which the Ottomans were subordinated to great power dictates. And thus, Armenians began to be seen increasingly as the internal enemy, as traitors. This line of narrative was present in the displayed books in the archives, and it was also present in the digital catalog of the archive. When I accessed the archives catalog through the computers of the reading room, a number of themes appeared on the main page to direct the researcher to relevant documents. Half of the 10 themes on the site related to Armenians. Among these themes, the only ethnicity that appeared was Armenian, and as such, Armenian was the demarcated ethnicity of the archive. Again, Armenians in these themes are cast negatively, as perpetrators themselves. The first themes reads documents and massacres committed by Armenians. The second one simply says Armenian committees, which refers to the Armenian revolutionary parties, one of which I mentioned earlier, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, that emerged in the 1890s and for much of the 90s until the Young Turk Revolution in 1908. The Armenian parties undertook various acts of violence, a couple of times directly targeting the Ottoman Sultan Abdulhamid II. These acts of violence were a form of resistance against the economic, social, and political oppressions that Armenians, particularly in the East, faced. Of course, what is seen as resistance from the point of view of the victim groups is seen as insurrection, uprising, and a security threat by the oppressors. Although a small minority of Armenians were involved with these parties, and the parties themselves, namely the Armenian Revolutionary Federation and the Hınçak Party, were formed outside of the Ottoman Empire, and much of their leadership came from Tiflis, in the capital of modern-day Georgia, or Geneva, with their base cities. Increasingly, through the new technology of photography and the print media, Armenians of the Ottoman Empire were cast and stereotyped in the image of these revolutionary fighters. So this image of Armenians as traitors of the Ottoman Empire emerged in the Ottoman Empire, but then continued on in the narratives of the Republic of Turkey. These narratives, as I demonstrated, are displayed in the archive. They also represent the narrative and image of Armenian that is presented to every student in schools of Turkey. A focus on the revolutionary groups and other resistance activities by Armenians prior and during the genocide, dubbed as uprisings, has also been the focus of denialist narratives in the United States, based scholars such as Stanford Shaw, Justin McCarthy, Edward Erickson, Gunter Louie, among others, who represented the loudest voices in the American Academy as it pertained to the Armenian issue until well into the 1990s. The denialist line of argumentation in the United States has been overwhelmed by Armenian genocide scholarship produced in the last 20 years. But in Turkey, in the public sphere, Armenian still continues to hold a negative connotation, to the degree that in 2014, at the time, Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who was running for the office of presidency, during an interview and in a discussion about the ethno-religious identity of his opponent, wanted to assert that he himself was of Turkish descent. He noted that he had been called a Georgian. Then in the next line, he said, "I apologize, but they have called me uglier things. They have called me an Armenian, but I am a Turk." End of quote. This quote was uttered in the summer of 2014, which is when I was conducting my research in Turkey. At the same time, in the same year, there were still attempts by the presidential candidates to present Turkey as a country that wanted to make peace with its neighbors and wanted to be more inclusive of the various ethno-religious minorities living in Turkey, that include a tiny population of 40,000 Armenians, mainly based in Istanbul, and even smaller numbers of Greeks, but larger numbers of Kurds and Alevi. The overall population in Turkey is about 85 million, just to give you context of what percentage Armenians make up in Turkey. While I worked in the Ottoman archive in the summer of 2014, among a few PR pieces on the main page of the archive's website, at the time ran an article entitled, "We are waiting for Armenians to come to the archive." Was such an article conveyed an intention to welcome Armenian researchers to the archive? Surely sounded ironic given the context I was in and that I described earlier. As an Armenian, I could not help but feel singled out in the Ottoman archive. Now, what I have presented to you is not a common way of talking about the Ottoman archives and the genocide. Much of the discussion regarding the Ottoman archives and the genocide concern whether the Ottoman archives hides or information pertaining to the Armenian genocide or has destroyed information regarding the Armenians. But I find these discussions redundant because all archives hide information and contain silences to the organization of the archive. And it's precisely a historian's job to be aware of those silences and fill in the gaps. The fact is that since the 2000s, historians like Taner Akçam, Uğur Ümit Ünger, Fuat Dündar, Ümit Kürt, Hilmar Kaiser, among others, have used the Ottoman archives to write about the Armenian genocide. I'm mentioning these names also to recognize that authors of Turkish and Kurdish descent, among others, have written about the Armenian genocide in and outside of Turkey. And for a few years since the 2000s, it was even possible to organize conferences on the Armenian genocide in Turkey. These openings of discussion about the Armenian genocide occurred in the backdrop of Turkey's accession talks to the European Union. This is also the time when the famous Armenian journalist, Hrant Dink, became one of the first figures to publicly and openly talk about the Armenian genocide in Turkey and call for reconciliation among Armenians and Turks. He became the impetus for dialogue to take place among Turkish and Armenian scholars that were held through conferences and workshops in Turkey and outside of Turkey. Usually, Boğaziçi University, Sabancı, and Berkeley universities from Turkey were actively participating to these conferences. Yet this did not happen without attacks on the scholars organizing and participating in the conferences. Hrant Dink himself, over the years, was threatened for openly speaking about the genocide and also, for claiming that Kemal Atatürk, the founder of Turkey, or founding father of Turkey, that his adopted daughter Sabiha Gökçen, who became a very famous pilot in Turkey, was of an Armenian descent. His discourses were seen as blasphemous, not just by radical groups in Turkey, but also by Turkish courts that opened cases against Dink for insulting Turkishness, which is a criminalized act in Turkey. Hrant Dink was eventually assassinated in January 2007 with the likely involvement of the Turkish state. Ironically, his assassination gave fruition to more discussion on the Armenian genocide among intellectuals in Turkey. It has instigated more interest among young students in Turkey to study Armenians of the Ottoman Empire and the Armenian genocide. And some of them pursued their graduate studies in Turkey, others in Europe, the United States. This I wanted to present as an example of consequences of denialism in Turkey, but also as a demonstration of the small steps that have been taken by non-state actors, scholars in particular, to expand discussion on Armenians, on the past of Armenians and the genocide in Turkey. So there have been small glimpses of hope for countering denialism and anti-Armenianism in Turkey. And this change is happening in the Turkish and American academies, as well as the public sphere, made it possible for me as an Armenian to enter the field of Ottoman studies, and in particular, Ottoman Armenian studies. But since the mid-2010s, repressions of free speech and scholarly work has increased in Turkey. So what was possible 10 years ago is no longer possible now, particularly in the public academic institutions. On the Armenian genocide still continue to be published in Turkish by the Armenian publishing house Aras, as well as the Turkish İletişim Publishing House, both of which are based in Istanbul. Of course, these books remain marginal in the public sphere. So to move on with my narrative, I want to open a different category of Ottoman archives, the non-traditional. And what I mean here is the geographical landscape of the Ottoman Empire and the material evidence that has survived or been destroyed on that landscape. To do this, I want to transport us from Istanbul to Van, which, as I mentioned, was the particular province that I focused my research on. And in Van in particular, I focused, I spent some time on the monastery of Varak that had housed a printing house in the 1850s, and which was very early for the any of the provinces, and where Makartich Farimyan, a very famous Armenian of the 19th century, who eventually became the Patriarch of the Constantinople and Catholicos of Echmiadzin, which is the highest office of the Armenian Church. In the 1950s, he established a school in this monastery of Varak. Of the Armenian monasteries and churches dotting this map, as you see here, the Varak monastery is among the few that has some walls and a roof that are still preserved, as you see here in this picture. So this is the old look of the monastery, and this is the current picture. And here's another one. And these are the conditions inside of the monastery. The adjacent buildings that would have housed, the adjacent buildings that you see on the left side of the picture that would have housed the school and the printing house are completely gone. And we have to understand that it's not just the structures that are in ruin, that this monastery and others would have housed many books, manuscripts, and other types of documents vital for historians that have long been destroyed, or some of them have been saved by being transported to Yerevan in Armenia. And usually that happened during the genocide. Many former Armenian structures and homes are in ruins. Often one can find newly built homes with a khachkar, that is an Armenian engraved cross stone, or stones with engraved Armenian letters, and part of the stones used to build new houses. Research conducted by historical sociologist Fatma Müge-Göçek has revealed that after World War I, quote, the Turkish military had often confiscated the Armenian properties for their own use. They turned former residences into official buildings and restricted access to old Armenian churches that they then often used for target practice, thereby destroying them beyond recognition, end of quote. So this is the old city of Van, where many of the urban Armenians lived, and where much of the documents that I've analyzed from archives now preserved in Paris and Yerevan had come from. As you can see, it is completely flattened. This is the view of the city from a height. And here are pictures of the city from before its destruction. The city also housed the prelacy of the Armenian diocese in Van, where important communication and records would have been kept about Armenians of the region. But there is no trace of the prelacy or any of the documents left. Of course, all of this has put limits to the extent to which one can conduct research on the Armenian lives of those who lived in Van before the genocide. In addition, Van represents the center of Armenian legends, the center of medieval Armenian kingdoms that have left behind some monumental sites. However, signs put up by Turkey's Ministry of Culture and Tourism that intend to provide information about ancient and medieval sites are completely void of any mention of the word Armenian. So, for example, at the entrance of the rock formation and fortress that stands adjacent to the city of Van, that you can see in the background here, there is a panel that reads as such. I'll read just a few lines of it. The Turco-Islamic period at Van Fortress and the old city of Van. The old city of Van, which was one of the leading cities of the region since the 11th century, flourished under the safe and massive shade of the Van Fortress and remained in the first quarter of the 20th century. The outer fortress was used in the Urartian and early Christian periods, but the existing remains are from the Turkish period. Then it goes on listing multiple mosques that existed in the city and surroundings, and also mentions, quote, the Christian churches, including Sup Bogos, Pedros Church, Sup Sahak Church, Sup Vatan Church, Sup Stepanos, Sup Dziranabor Church. Some of these names were misspelled, but most importantly, all these churches have Armenian names. Yet the word Armenian appears nowhere on the description of existing or destroyed monuments. This provides just one glimpse of how what remains of Armenian is never represented as Armenian, the Turkish touristic guides and panels, thus contributing to the continuous erasure of the Armenian past in the Republic of Turkey. To counter these types of erasures, counter Turkish nationalism, and to counter the view of Ottoman history from the Turkish nationalism prism, historians in the last 2 decades have begun to write a more inclusive history of the Ottoman Empire, considering its pre-World War I, multilingual, multi-religious, and multi-ethnic makeup by expanding their understanding of Ottoman archives to include also geographical landscapes of the Ottoman Empire, material evidence that has survived or been erased, as well as the non-Turkish language archives that have remained outside the borders of the successor state of the Ottoman Empire, the Republic. Additionally, more and more historians are considering archives that had to be taken out of the Republic of Turkey for the sake of preservation. In my case, I have considered Armenian archives or written materials produced in the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century that for the sake of preservation had been sent out of the Armenian Patriarchate of Constantinople in 1918 and eventually archived in the Armenian Nubar Library in Paris and the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. Other archival materials have ended up in Yerevan and preserved in different museum archives. This archival materials spread similar to the ways in which human survivors of the genocide dispersed all over the world: Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, Egypt, Iraq, France, the United States, Argentina, among other places, as well as the current Republic of Armenia. When I conducted research within the Armenian archives, for every village and town I encountered in the petitions of the mid-19th century sent by Armenians of Van to the Armenian Patriarchate, I had to find out the new name of the village in order to locate it. Since the establishment of Turkey, Greek, Arum, and Armenian place names were Turkified. To make the process more systematic, in 1957, a state organization was formed called Special Commission to change place names. This organization also became in charge of writing the local histories of different places in Turkey to present Turks only as the historical actors of any place in Turkey, thereby erasing the past existence of Armenians and Greek Roman, or Assyrians that were inhabiting the east of Turkey. Therefore, the task of writing the history of Armenians prior to the genocide requires to consistently undo the erasure imposed by the event of the genocide and the post-genocide policies of eliminating traces of Armenians in Eastern Turkey in the ancestral lands of Armenians. In conclusion to what I have presented to you today, I wanted not just to introduce to you the event of the Armenian genocide, but how being a historian of the pre-genocide era, studying Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, consists of peeling away layers that have not just been formed through the passing of time, but also through active acts of denialism of the Armenian genocide and active acts of erasure of an Armenian past in what is now the Republic of Turkey. This denial and erasure not only impact historical research, but contribute to the persisting negative attitudes towards Armenians and the treatment of the small numbers of Armenians that have remained in Turkey. Thank you.
Okay, so it is our tradition that the right to first question belongs to a student in the course. Yeah, Sam.
I don't know if you would know this, but I'm just curious, like, is the Armenian genocide very much like censored in schools in Turkey?
Yes. So you can't talk about the Armenian genocide as a genocide in the schools of Turkey. And based on experience, I can say when I was studying Turkish at one of the most prestigious universities in Istanbul, I had a TA who was 18-year-old who graduated from high school, and she asked me, "You know what happened in 1915?" But she had a sense that something had happened, but no way to access information. So it's not only not allowed to talk about the genocide, but also information about it is not easily acceptable. Yeah.
Questions?
I was fortunate enough to find Ron Sunni's They Can Live in the Desert But Nowhere Else at a used bookstore. Can you comment on his work relative to what you've discussed about the changes in research, and if it succeeds in breaking the ceiling of the obstacles you discussed?
Yes. Ron Sunni's work is very much based on the scholarship that has already been created, right? I think he's a great narrator, and I use his book for teaching the Armenian genocide. I think books like his have made information and scholarship on the genocide more accessible in the American Academy. For me, the more important work that he did was that he was one of the organizers of the workshop of Armenian and Turkish scholars that became the first venue for Turkish and Armenian scholars to meet and discuss about the Armenian genocide. And later on, that became a venue for not just about the Armenian genocide, but the general history of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. So in his generation, it was almost impossible for an Armenian and Turkish scholar to come together. By the time I arrived to graduate school, that that obstacle had been broken because of these workshops that had taken place. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Questions? Yeah, Larry?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could compare the two ideas of the colonial economic reasons for deeply penetrating this area with railroads and economies and stuff versus the idea that the new regime would have some sort of ideological new identity and the Armenian people were simply sort of standing in the way of that. And that whether or not that reason superseded the economic modus and rationale of the great powers.
Mhm. So, I'm trying to understand the connection between the two points. The great powers were not intending to eliminate the Armenians of the right. In the Armenians from the Ottoman empires, in the contrary, they acted as protectors of this group in the empire. Whereas the ideology that emerged in Turkey as it was transitioning from empire to nation states was not unique to Turkey. Armenians were seen as a security threat, therefore they were physically annihilated. But of course, Greeks were also massively deported from Turkey to make it a more homogeneous and ethno-national state. Just like Muslims were also deported from Greece and other Balkan states to the Republic of Turkey. So the ideal new state was to be a homogeneous ethnic state, and that's part of what drove the genocide and new forms of state. I'm not sure I answered your question.
Well, is the greater emphasis, you hit it both right correctly, is that, so was it more of an emphasis of wanting to create the new Turkish identity and therefore eliminate the Armenians from the area?
Mm-hmm.
Or was it the colonial approach? Because time and time again, we see the idea of the great powers coming in and dominating over indigenous people and dividing things up, putting their infrastructures in, driving people out and stuff like that. I'm just wondering what the predominant force was. Was it the colonial adventures going in there, or was it mainly the desire of the Turks themselves to continue to have their own existential life of themselves? And then what really drove this was their need to have a homogeneous Turkish identity.
Well, I think they're both interconnected because the intervention of the colonial states were really why the young Turks in the Ottoman Empire was feeling threatened, right? And they saw Armenians as the means through which the colonial states were gaining more power in the Ottoman Empire. So that made Armenians a target. And I think, I don't know, if the security threat didn't exist, would they target Armenians as to have a homogeneous state? I think it's less likely. I think that the threat is a very important dynamic here.
And then the follow-up question was, go ahead. The idea of the millet system was very important during this period, I guess. But what happened to the millet system where these religious minorities were sort of allowed their own areas and their own control sort of over their own communities and stuff? What happened to the millet system once the Young Turks came into power?
Right. So in the last 20 years, historians have increasingly started to argue that the millet system didn't really exist as a system, and that it was actually being turned into a system in the second half of the 19th century. So yes, different religious communities had power over family law. So certain communal conflicts could be resolved from within the boundaries of a religious community. But to what extent we can call that autonomous has definitely been questioned, especially in literature that has come out in the last 5 years. They did the Rum Greek Church owned property, the Armenian Church, owned property. So they had through which they could raise money, raise taxes, right? But there was no, they didn't have control over specific pieces of land necessarily, but more the benefits, the economic benefits that they could get from lands that they had. Property is not the right word, but the right to use the economic outcomes of those lands was given to different churches. So what happened after the genocide is that through the Lausanne Treaty, the rights of minorities were dictated on Turkey, and those rights stipulated that Armenian Greeks and other groups could have their own ethnic schools where their language could be taught. So there, the church continued to have some property in the way it had before, but of course the Armenian church only has property in Istanbul and maybe some other Western cities, but not that doesn't have control over other churches in the Eastern provinces.
Andrea?
Oh, this may seem like a silly aside, but as a child at the 1950s, I had to eat my vegetables because of the starving Armenians. It made no sense, but it was certainly not anything from school, and it was certainly not Armenian, but it was a neighborhood chant of some sort. So at least some Christians on the northeastern part of this country in the Cold War were fretting about Armenians, go figure. But more importantly, why do you think the Armenian genocide is so forgotten? Is it because in the chaos of dividing up the world post-World War I, 1919, there was so much chaos, and certainly from the American point of view, we didn't pay any attention to those things much. Is there another way to understand it?
I mean, the reason I've heard of this starving Armenian story, and it is the American, especially missionary groups, sent a lot of help for the Armenian refugees after World War I. They abandoned their efforts as the Soviet Union was formed, as Armenia became part of the Soviet Union. And with that, they also abandoned much of their discussion of the Armenian genocide in the United States. Before that, from 1915 to 1922-23, the Armenian genocide was spoken about tremendously, and tremendous money was raised. I don't remember the numbers now, for helping Armenian refugees. I think there's a new movie, Aurora Sunrise. If you can watch that, it gives a very good idea of America's role in providing help to Armenians.
Again,
Aurora Sunrise. So Aurora is an Armenian genocide survivor woman who was part of the campaign of raising money in the United States and played in a movie that was later destroyed. As the United States dropped discussion of the Armenian genocide on the official level. As to why the Armenian genocide is forgotten in the United States, yeah, I think there are too many cards that the United States has to play. But also, of course, now a majority of states in the United States, I think, have recognized the Armenian genocide, and that has to do with the Armenian lobby groups that have advocated for the recognition of the Armenian genocide on the state level, and as well as the teaching of the Armenian genocide.
And Professor, ask a question. So you spoke of this younger generation of scholars who has gone in to the Ottoman archives and read between the lines and found evidence of the genocide. Is that archival suicide, so to speak? I mean, once the Turkish authorities know that you've done that, are you then subsequently banned from returning in the way that Jan Gross was banned from Poland after publishing Neighbors?
So in the 90s, I know Janet Klein, she worked on the Hamidiye regiment that were organized military units in the late 1880s and 90s that organized the massacres of Armenians in the 1890s, not the genocide. And she wrote about the topic, and she was banned access to the archive. But I don't, and I very naively, when I went to the archive, I said I want to study the Kurdish Armenian land problems, which is also not a very, which I didn't end up studying anyways. But it's something that would have been seen controversial, but it didn't affect my work. And the Ottoman archives are generally, if you have a Turkish credit card, you can have access to a lot of the material digitally. So it has become very open, and I don't know of anyone recently among the people I've mentioned that have lost access to the archives. So in that sense, it's
so I imagine a lot of people in your field have Turkish bank accounts and Turkish credit cards.
I don't know. I don't have it. I've just used friends
Yeah.
who then do them or whatever. Yeah. But the digitization is something that happened while I was in Berkeley.
Hey, Christine.
Yeah, so I've got to ask, I mean, they know your name is Armenian.
Oh, yeah.
So how did they, number one, let you in? And with the campaign of erasure, why would they have anything in the archive? Why wouldn't they just destroy it?
One, I am not the only Armenian that has access to the only Armenian with the Armenian name. So I think there is no policy to, and as I said on their website, it said, we want Armenians to come to the archive. So if anything, I could be shown as a token that, see, we are letting Armenians enter our archive. In terms of destruction of evidence, I showed you the huge complex. There is no way that anybody can code through that much material. And I'm sure that there are certain documents that have been deleted, but there's so much information that when a historian gets a file and starts reading, they might be the first one reading the documents, and no archivist has read it before to know that whether it's something that would benefit state narrative or not.
So who has found was it Tana Aksham that found some of the best archive information? Was it Bahakin? Who?
I don't know what we mean by best. I think because I think assuming that certain archival documents are more important than others sort of suggests that there is one or two documents that have proven that the genocide has happened. I think we don't have an issue of proving the genocide. I think there is more than enough evidence And yes, a lot of Armenian scholars have written the history of the genocide in order to prove it, but that's just a reaction to the denialism. And I don't think it's a historical necessity. I think historians have now moved beyond, hopefully, that scholarship of trying to be the judge, and are trying to explain the genocide. For example, there are two different arguments regarding the genocide, whether it's the genocide is something that was caused through the Hamidian regime. So some historians see the Hamidian regime policies as the beginning of the Armenian genocide. Others, like Ron Sunni, think that the Armenian genocide was a contingent event, that is, an event that happened in the moment of World War I because of different political, military, global factors that aligned with each other that pushed the Young Turks to commit the genocide, but not something that was planned from 1880, 1890, even 1912. So those are the main two conflicting arguments in the field of the genocides, but I think of the Armenian genocides, but also more and more Armenian genocide studies is moving towards the experience of the genocide rather than the political aspect of the Armenian genocide. And that's a new development within Armenian genocide.
Please introduce yourself.
I'm Michael Perry. I'm married to an Armenian. Turkey is obviously an important strategic ally of the United States. Can you talk about how that relationship in modern times affects the ability of politicians in the United States to talk about the genocide?
I'm not the best expert on it, but I will give the last example of it with the mayor of New York, who was in collaboration with, I don't know if you heard this, though, but was basically accepted bribes from the Turkish government and closed his eyes to certain fire regulations for the construction of the new consulate in New York. and in return, they asked him not to commemorate the Armenian genocide that New York mayors traditionally have been doing on an annual basis. I think U.S.-Turkish relations are changing all the time. Of course, when the Soviet Union existed and Turkey was bordering the Soviet Union, I think that relationship was even more strategic and important for the United States than now. But still, Turkey is, of course, a very important regional actor, an ally to the United States that at different times has levels of influence on the American government. They might be better people to talk about the different stages of how Turkish American relations have impacted the way U.S. officials have talked.
Hello.
So you talked about, like, regardless of whether or not it was sort of the main reason of creating an ethno-state, this persecution of an ethnicity, and then you also mentioned the persecution by the Ottomans of other, like, Christian minorities. And so while you did talk about, like, younger scholar generations, I was wondering, in your experience in, if it was Turkey or Armenia, what would you say, like, how did that trickle down to the general population in a way? How did that sort of influence more mainstream non-academic culture and generations that followed in the last 100 years?
Yeah, a very good question. I mean, as I mentioned, the schools in Turkey enforce a particular narrative of Armenians in their history textbooks, right? So the Ottoman history lasted for more than 500 years, and Armenians lived in the Ottoman Empire in those 500 years. But in the historical chronology that is presented to students in Turkey, Armenians really appear in 1878. That's when the Treaty of Berlin was signed. That's when colonialist powers began to be speaking on behalf of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, and then particularly the revolutionaries that were seen as a threat to Ottoman existence. Those are the figures presented as part of the Armenian history in the Ottoman Empire. I could talk about similarly the way students in Armenia are educated as well. Of course, the portrayal of Turkey is largely through the prism of the genocide, and in diaspora and Armenian schools as well. The narratives presented about Turks are not positive, so it is the genocide. So schooling is one method through which the genocide overtakes the way Turkish-Armenian relations are imagined. Yeah, I would say education is one of the main shapers of the dynamic, but of course, media is also very important.
A hand up over here.
Do you have any sense of the potential for improving relations between Turkey and Armenia? It doesn't look good. I was just wondering if you had any different ideas.
Well, I actually doesn't look good, but right now it's at the most promising place. There is discussion or meetings happening between the Turkish government and the Armenian current administration, and so I don't know how many people know, but there is a conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, and that, of course, has had a great impact in the relation of Armenia and Turkey. But Turkey wants to see a road or transportation routes opened between Azerbaijan and Turkey that would go through Armenia, and that's a motivating factor for Turkey to potentially open the borders with Armenia that is blocked right now. But there is immense trade happening, mostly imports from Turkey to Armenia. I mean, the Armenian economy is already dependent to a certain extent on Turkish economy. There are Armenian labor migrants who go and work in Turkey. That has been a phenomenon for the last 20, 30 years. So there are interactions at different levels as to when there will be a diplomatic breakthrough.
I think we have time for one more question. Julia.
You mentioned that, I think in your talk, that there was a period where the genocide was kind of becoming more openly discussed within Turkey and was kind of coming to the fore in terms of how people were acknowledging it, that became more buttoned up over the last decade or so. Have you noticed any pushback within Turkey, either by youth who are kind of eager to get this story out there and talk about it more, or by scholars, or by Armenians within Turkey or without Turkey? Has there been any pushback against these policies of denialism?
There is, I think we have to take that in the context of general repressions in Turkey. So the Armenian genocide is not the only and not necessarily the most delicate issue right now in Turkey. There are, since 2015 and protests against the Turkish government, there have been imprisonment of many people. So, for example, escaping my, Habala, his last name is. He was a philanthropist, a very rich man who financed studies, a Turkish man, who financed studies on Armenians, exhibitions having to do with Armenians, art exhibitions having to do with Armenians. And he's been in prison, I think since 2016, if I'm not mistaken. And so and not for his support of Armenians, but because he's been accused of wanting to topple the current Turkish administration. So the repressions have been very forceful, and many people have been imprisoned. So pushback is very difficult. There was an Armenian parliamentarian who was serving as a deputy in the parliament, who was speaking very openly about the Armenian genocide, and multiple times was attacked in the assembly. But he has since moved to the United States. He's no longer a deputy. So there is actually significant silencing, but again, not just on the Armenian issue, but in general.